want to talk about your most recent research on young people and suicide. Can you tell me what you studied and what you found?
The research that I was mentioning about suicide is from the CDC. It's their recently released survey. They do the survey every 2 years, and it's a nationally representative sample of high school students. So they just released the new data maybe 3 weeks ago.
What did they find?
What they found is that high school students talking about suicide, having thoughts about suicide has risen slightly since the last survey, which was in 2017. So it's about 1 in 6 high school students that participate in the survey, which again, it's nationally representative. So 1 in 6 of them reported having thought about suicide in the 12 months prior to taking the survey. And then 1 in 6 had actually made a plan. And then about 1 in 10 reported having actually attempted suicide in the past year.
And those numbers are up by about how much?
They're not up by a lot. Like it was maybe 13% had reported thinking about suicide, and now it's up to about 14.5%.
Those numbers just sound shocking. But for someone who studies it, are you surprised?
This is kind of the trend we've seen. It's actually been going down. So one of the surprising things, or upsetting things about this, is that even though it's a small increase, it is an increase, whereas the trend had been that it had been going down. The other thing that people find particularly shocking is those numbers for LGBTQ youth are much higher. About half of LGBTQ youth reported having thought about suicide in the past year. And about 40% said they'd made a plan on how to do it.
Was that survey done prior to COVID starting?
This survey was done in 2019 in high schools across the country. So it doesn't reflect COVID, the pandemic. We do have surveys that are showing there's much higher rates of anxiety. A lot of the suicide prevention hotlines are reporting larger numbers of youth and adults as well calling in about suicide. So while we don't have a nationally representative survey like this, because this is the most recent one, we definitely have an indication that there's much more risk happening.
What would you say to parents when you're looking at these numbers? Do we have any indication why, after a trend of seeing things go down, the numbers are spiking?
It's kind of early still to know what's happening, particularly because could just be a blip. It just could be a one-time kind of increase. But something else that the data show are that the risk of suicide has gone up, particularly for African American youth and especially for males. So while their numbers are lower than most other racial groups, it's increased from around 7% to about 10%. So it's just a bigger percentage increase for that group. And one of the reasons that people think that's happening, which is related to the high numbers for LGBTQ youth also, is discrimination. These youth are experiencing racism or homophobia, and so the discrimination that they're feeling can compound any other kind of underlying worries or just triggers for suicide that might already be there. And we're seeing that it's kind of more prevalent now in terms of social media and the media. There's just a lot more talk about race and racism, and so that's one of the reasons people are thinking that the rate might be increasing for African American youth.
We had talked about the fact that anxiety and stress also seems to be, at least anecdotally, on the rise with COVID. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I think part of the reason that anxiety and stress has gone up is that it's so unknown. When we know, okay, this is a situation, it's challenging, but it's going to be for 2 months, then it'll end. So we as adults who have longer experience dealing with things, even we are thrown off by this unknown of when are things going to get back to normal. So imagine children and youth who are dealing with this and don't understand, or they're kind of, for for adolescents, peers and social interactions are a key component of the developmental stages that they're going through. And now they're not able to spend time with their friends in the way that they used to. And I would say, especially now that school is starting back up, none of us thought this is what was going to happen this fall, back in the spring. So imagine youth who are kind of being told you're going to go home, so you're not going to see your friends and teachers, but probably the message was you'll be able to go and see them again in the fall, so don't worry. And now the fall isn't as anybody expected either. And again, for LGBTQ youth, school can often be one of the places where they have a positive connection with an adult, or they're part of a student group that gives them support. So the fact that they're being separated physically from a lot of those supports can also increase the stress and anxiety that those youth particularly are feeling at this time, and particularly for youth who are in families that are not supportive of their identities. Now they're at home all the time, so it can really increase stress for them.
What do parents need to know? What can they do with everybody under one roof right now? They're not going anywhere for most of the time.
I think one of the opportunities with the pandemic is really to start breaking down that stigma with mental health. It's in the news, people are seeing this is challenging, everybody's feeling challenged. So we have an opportunity to really say, hey, that's normal. We're all kind of dealing with that, and what we need to do is talk about it. So starting to have those conversations with your kids where you're really bringing these issues up, and I would recommend doing it as soon as possible, not when you're worried about something, but start as soon as you can, of just saying, hey, I just wanted to talk to you about how things are going. Even the new school year can be another great opportunity to say, I just want to check in, because we all thought this school year was going to be starting off different than it is. And it might be different than years in the past. And there might be some great things, but there also might be some tough things. And I just want you to know that you can always tell me about the tough things. And start that conversation so that it's not scary, and so that they're not wondering, is it going to be okay? Because kids often notice adults having stress and they want to save them from the stress. So they might not tell their parents something because they don't want to add extra worry onto their parents, who are already probably very clearly worried. So making sure you are very explicitly giving that message that you are okay with hearing about the tough stuff that is happening for them can help them feel more comfortable with sharing.
We have kids who are also starting college under unusual circumstances, or finishing college and being launched into the real world under unusual circumstances. What the stress level could be, and maybe what parents need to keep in mind for those kids too.
And I think adults have their own struggles, so it doesn't matter what age you are, you definitely are going to be having some struggles. And having a message from somebody who cares about you, that they want to hear about it when you're struggling, and that you don't need to worry about overburdening them, because there is help. And I think that's a key thing to let people know, is that there is help, and if you're going through something difficult, we can work on getting you help, but it's really hard to do anything when nobody else knows what you're going through. So particularly as a family member, making sure they know, I am one of those people who is absolutely going to want to hear about it.
Is there anything in particular you would want parents to know about this subsetting?
I would say definitely, again, give that message that it's okay to talk to me about the hard stuff. A lot of kids going away to college might want to show that they can handle it, and so they don't necessarily want to ask for help. But really kind of saying, this, again, you can kind of fall back to the pandemic and say, this is not the way most people go off to college, so it's totally fine if it doesn't feel okay sometimes, and you should definitely tell me. Sharing resources, you might want to find out what the number is to call at your student's school, so that you can say, if you don't want to talk to me, that there's this number at your school that you can call. There are people who are on campus and understand what's going on there. and this is their job. Don't feel bad about burdening them with your problems. These are really the people who are there to help you in addition to me. So, making sure that you can help connect them and give them the message that this is all okay to talk about and you don't need to act like it's not bothering you.
You had mentioned that suicide is unfortunately pretty high up there in terms of deaths for young people. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Unfortunately, something that people don't always realize is suicide is actually the second leading cause of death among adolescents in the United States after accidents and unintentional injuries. So it's really, it's something that we need to be aware of and be talking about. And, again, I think the message is mental health. Talk about mental health. Talk about struggles. Don't keep them to yourself. Parents can even kind of model that and say, you do not want to give your children your anxieties by sharing your problems with them and hoping they'll help you solve them. But you definitely want to model for them that you're doing things to take care of your anxiety and, letting them see that when things bother you, you reach out and you get help. That's an important message because it can help.
Is there anything I didn't ask you, Brandon, that you would want to make sure that people know?
There's this misconception that if you ask someone about suicide who is thinking about it, you might make them more likely to commit suicide because you've mentioned it. And actually what we find is that's the opposite, that it's a hard thing to tell someone that you've been thinking about killing yourself. And so asking opens the door for them to tell you something that they really needed to tell you. And so we hope to give the message that, it's okay to share your struggles. But when we ask about that, explicitly, it opens the door for them to say, yeah, and it shows them that you're willing to hear their answer. There is something called suicide contagion, and so the way we talk about suicide is important, particularly when there is a suicide. We don't want to make it sound like it's the inevitable choice that somebody made or that this had to happen. So really kind of stressing that there is help out there and that it's important to talk to somebody and not really dwell on the details of how somebody committed suicide, because we don't want to kind of put details into somebody's mind, and we don't want to make it seem like more people will pay attention to you if this has happened. But again, you do want to make sure that they feel okay talking about it. And in terms of talking about it, again, it's about being non-judgmental. And even, for example, if you ask, have you been thinking about killing yourself? And they say no, our first reaction is to be relieved and say, oh, well, thank goodness. I'm so glad to hear that. But what you've just done is tell them you don't want to hear that they were. So it's really important. That natural response is natural and fine, but to say, well, but if you ever did have those thoughts, please know that you can tell me about it. I'm really glad that's not happening now, but if things change, tell me. It's okay. We'll work on it together. So just making sure that, all of your discussions about suicide are non-judgmental and are really focused on that there is help.